Debussy from the late 1900s into the 20th century by Debussy. And now we'll be hearing a lecture by Asa Simon Mittman talking about before they were sciences, maps, race, and history, way, way back in the Middle Ages. Asa Simon Mittman is professor of art and art history at California State University at Chico. He's taught at St. Catherine's College at the University of Cambridge, the National University of Ireland in Galway, and New York University, and has given over 100 lectures, just count them, on his research in sites including Boston, Cambridge, Chicago, London, Los Angeles, New Haven, New York, Oxford, Paris, Princeton, and, believe it or not, Reykjavik. His research has been supported by CAA, ICMA, Cress Mellon, American Philosophical Society, and NEA grants. Mittman co-curated the world's first major museum exhibition, on the history of monstrosity, medieval monsters, terrors, aliens, wonders at the Pierpont Morgan Library and Museum, the Cleveland Museum of Art, and the Blanton Museum of Art in 2018 with Sherry Lindquist. He is author of Maps and Monsters in Medieval England and Inconceivable Beasts, The Wonders of the East in the Beowulf manuscript, which was awarded a publication grant from the College Art Association and an ISAS Best Book Prize, and is author and co-author of approximately 50 articles on medieval art and culture. He edited the research companion to Monsters and the Monstrous, Monstrosity, Disability, and Post-Human in the Medieval and Early Modern World, and classical readings on monster theory, Demonstrator Volume 1, and primary sources on monsters, Demonstrate, and is an editor of 2 books. So just to let you know, after all this talk about monsters, you may have some questions. And if you do, I encourage you to write them into the chat, and we will address as many as we possibly can. A good idea for some of you who are new to these kinds of presentations, just have your phone available, or a pencil and paper might be even better, just to jot down your questions as Dr. Mittman proceeds with his lecture so that you don't forget them. Dr. Mittman, we welcome you to the Voices of Culture lecture series. We're happy you're with us, even if it's just by Zoom.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Asia, for that very warm and kind welcome. I always feel vaguely exhausted when I hear a list of what I've been doing, but I really appreciate it. And thanks as well to my old friend and colleague, Professor Robert Gordon. It's a pleasure to be working with you. And I've never followed such a beautiful prior participant. So thank you ever so much, Daniel, for the beautiful performance. I deeply appreciate it. And thank you all for coming. So I'm going to share my screen. And you should all now have before you the title screen, Before They Were Sciences, Maps, Race, and History in the Middle Ages. And so I will get going. Today, I will discuss a series of interlocking subjects: the history of medieval maps, the writing of history itself, and the role that both of these have played in the construction of the idea of race that, again, occupies much of our public debate. I'll start by introducing you to the scope, content, and context of medieval Christian maps, about which little tends to be known outside of the very small circle of academics that I live in. And what is generally known about medieval maps tends to be wrong. If you have thought about them at all, you have probably thought about ideas about the world being flat and also being randomly filled up with dragons. both of which are not the case for medieval maps. They knew the world was round, as I'll talk about in a little bit. And they did fill them with monsters, but very much not randomly, quite intentionally. So I'll deal with both of these misconceptions along the way toward introducing you to medieval maps, which are rather fascinating and strange things. And then I will argue some for why I think we need to pay some attention to them and the worldviews they reflect and foster. As far as we can tell, there actually weren't many maps drawn in medieval Europe. There's approximately 150 that survived from the 8th through the 14th century, which is about a little over 100 per century. That's not so many, but we have lost more manuscripts than we've managed to preserve. So if we have that many surviving, there could be easily 10 times as many that had originally been made in the period. This would be a large number of manuscripts from most medieval texts. There is, for example, only one copy that survives of the famous Beowulf that you can see now on the right. And that one barely survived a terrible fire in the 18th century, which is why the edges are all crinkly and it's, I kid you not, scotch taped into a paper frame. But maps are both deeply conventional, and within their conventions, they're highly varied and they come up in a variety of contexts. So they're more like a genre than an individual text, so still pretty small numbers. Medieval Christian maps of the world are generally called Mapamundi, which is a Latin phrase that literally translates to tablecloths or napkins of the world, because apparently many of them were originally on cloth, though very few of those survive. But that term mappa also seems to have come to signify drawings or paintings of the world. Less common terms are orbis pictus, orbis terrarum, descriptio, forma, figura, tabula, imago mundi, image of the world, table, form, figure, sphere of the description of the sphere of the world, and so on. I don't know of any medieval European vernacular, any common language from the Middle Ages that actually has a word that means map, which tells us something about how common they probably were not. So there's no English word, no French word, no German word, no Spanish word, no Portuguese word from the Middle Ages that means map. Mostly what they did was borrow the Latin term. So in English text, you can find this Mapamundi, which is just an English slight variation on the Latin. So this thing, Mapamundi, it names a curious genre. Leading historians of cartography, Catherine Delano Smith and Roger Kane, called it the most idiosyncratic, even spectacular map genre of all time. Not bad. These Mapamundi, like the Grand Hereford Map, which you see here, which is about 5 feet tall and has over 1,000 inscriptions on it, frequently combine narratives, including the flow of Christian history within their geographical and spatial structure. Mapmakers followed the writings of several important theologians who argued that history actually moved not only forward in time, but also across the globe from east to west. They therefore often start up at the top. They're oriented toward the Orient, that is to say, toward the east. And at the top, we find the Garden of Eden, which they considered to be a literal location at the world's furthest eastern extent. And if we work our way down a bit, we get to a city called Enoch, which this map calls the oldest city in the world. So we go from where they believe mankind to have come from to the first city founded outside of that. And if we work our way down the map, that is westward, that is forward in time, we get to the Tower of Babel. That's that giant tower you can see there. The arrival of the Jews in Canaan, following the wandering in the desert, and further onward to Christ on the cross. That is, these remarkable, fascinating works are not merely geographies, but geo-historical repositories. They're practically encyclopedias of medieval knowledge about space and time. In fact, the Hereford Map describes itself in an inscription as an histoire, that is, a history, a story, a narrative with a number of plot lines that the reader and viewer can follow across its extent. However, while many Mapamundi depict events, moments, past, present, and future, their information isn't presented in a clear sequential order. If you read a history book, You start at the beginning, you work to the end, and you follow off in the flow of history that way. But with a spatial work like a map, where do you start? How do you travel? Where do you go? Because information on a map is arrayed in space rather than time, we can explore these plots with some freedom. We can go wherever we want, but map makers do use various visual strategies to guide us through the stories that they tell. So who actually made these maps? The discipline of cartography proper didn't exist as a separate field in the Middle Ages. As far as we can tell, map makers were people who made all kinds of visual and textual images. We know very few names of people responsible for them, but one famous map maker of the period was a man named Matthew Paris, who was a 13th century Benedictine monk at the monastery of St. Albans, which is about an hour outside of London today. Now, he made a whole lot of kinds of maps. In fact, he seems to have invented whole map genres, from itinerary maps, that's the straight line ones, to regional maps, which more or less didn't exist at the time. That's the earliest map of Great Britain that survives, to maps like the map of the so-called Holy Land, which is next to it. But map making was just one of the many things he did. For example, he also made chronicles, genealogies, like the image on the left. He did some lovely zoological illustrations, including the first European depiction of an elephant from life. There was an elephant given as a gift to the King of England. It was kept in the Tower of London. It unfortunately, therefore, died there. But before dying, Matthew Paris made it there and drew us a picture. He also made all kinds of bizarre things, like this thing on the right, which is a fortune-telling device. It's a wheel that actually turns, and you line it up with your own astrological moments. So, yeah, he made maps, but he wasn't a cartographer, professionally speaking, in any sense. Map making wasn't an exclusive activity made, conducted by these cartographers, but rather part of the larger intellectual and religious project of the scholarly and monastic community of medieval Christian culture. Now, bearing that in mind liberates maps from wrong-headed critiques exemplified by a fellow named Charles Beasley, who wrote a very important history of cartography in 1906, in which he says, "The non-scientific maps of the later Middle Ages are of such complete futility that a bare allusion to the monstrosities of Hereford and Ebsdorf should suffice." Hereford being the map you see right here. This is a view of cartography that sees it always serving the same end as modern cartography and slowly moving along, progressing falteringly toward what Beasley called, as the title of his book, the dawn of modern geography. This is a wrong-headed view of this. Medieval map making has very little to do with modern versions thereof. It was instead a bold, powerful, and I'd argue highly effective practice aimed at constructing arguments about geography, history, religion, eschatology, which is the study of the end of the world, nationality, zoology, monstrosity, humanity, on and on and on. The dominant Christian map form of the Middle Ages was not fancy complex things like the Hereford map. It was instead the so-called TO map. You see one of these here. And it often showed up sort of like a frontispiece to the geography that was the geographical content in a really important early medieval text, the thing called the Etymologies by Isidore of Seville, who was a bishop in Seville. And he thought that you could explain all of God's divine plan by understanding the etymology, the root of Latin words. And so here he's discussing orbis terrarum, the sphere of the earth, and Asia and Europe and Africa and so on. And this image often comes up at the start of that. So these TO maps, they barely even look like maps to us at all, but they did not go away when supposedly better map forms came into use. They are used straight through the entire Middle Ages because they are a schematic image that's useful for conveying the layout of the world from a Christian perspective. Hundreds of these survive in comparison to the dozen or so of the more detailed types. They're deceptively simple. These diagrammatic maps are actually jam-packed with perspectives and ideologies, as are all maps. The TO map format is based on the division of the world into 3 parts. This is a modified one, but it's got a bit more text, which is useful. They believe the world is divided into 3 parts, 1 part for each of the sons of Noah. And we can see them labeled here: Asia for Shem, Europe for Japheth, Africa for Ham. The T of the TO is formed by 3 bodies of water that they believe divided up these locations. The vertical line in the center, Mare Magnum, that's the Great Sea. That's the Mediterranean. To the left is the Tanais River, which nobody thinks is important anymore, but they thought was the division between Europe and Asia. Sometimes they thought that. And then to the right is Nilus Flumus, the Nile River, which is where they put the division between Africa and Asia most of the time. There are we could argue in essence that the Hereford Map, which we'll return to again, is basically a TO map, but expanded and made much more complicated. And the edges are all made crinkly and wavy rather than straight and linear. And some TO maps even follow it more closely than that, really very neatly paralleling it as it is structured. Other major maps, this is the Ebsdorf map. It was the largest map that we know of ever made in the Middle Ages. It was destroyed when the Allies bombed Hanover, but a full-scale reproduction of it was made first. It is 12 feet across, so an absolutely giant map. And you can see that here it highlights the way that the T of the TO was interpreted through a Christian gloss as the cross of Christ, or as Christ's body itself. You see his hands and feet poking out at the sides and bottom, and his face up at the very top. And this was a way that mapmakers tried to suggest that the Christian message was truly ecumenical, which doesn't mean what we tend to think it means. The ecumene is a word in Latin that comes from a Greek word oikumene that means the inhabitable world. So literally anywhere on earth that people could possibly live, that's the ecumene. And so if someone argues that their belief is ecumenical, what that means is that it is designed to cover the entire inhabitable world. And that is what these maps argue. So this ecumenical message is utterly colonialist. And frankly, it's even genocidal. If this message can spread everywhere, runs the logic of these maps, it should spread everywhere, leaving no space on earth for non-Christians to exist. While it's easy to dismiss these TO maps as absurd, they in no way convey to us the world as we know it, we should pause before we do so. Beneath their surface, they're no different than any other mapping form. As cartographic theorist Dennis Woods reminds us, there's nothing natural about any map. It is a cultural artifact, an accumulation of choices made among choices, every one of which reveals a value. Not the world, but a slice of a piece of the world. Not nature, but a slant on it. Not innocent, but loaded with intentions and purposes. Not directly, but through a glass. Not straight, but mediated by words and other signs. Not, in a word, as it is. TO maps are beneath their surface qualities, no different from any other mapping form. All maps, including the TO maps, the Hereford map, and all the others I'll talk about, are arguments or collections of interlocking arguments. For example, credible cases have been made demonstrating that the Hereford map contains arguments about the nature of England and of Christians and Christianity, about the differences among European groups, between Europeans and the peoples of Asia and Africa, about Jesus and Mary, heaven and hell, Jerusalem, the flow of history, the ages of man, spectatorship, the necessity of the Crusades, the conquest of Ireland, the saintliness of a local bishop, and the universal nature of salvation. And that's just a handful of recent, very persuasive cases that have been made about that one map. You'll be relieved to know I'm not going to go over all of those today. Instead, I'm going to focus just on one key element of these maps. And this is one that's been largely ignored in scholarship on the period: the construction and presentation of ideas about race. Race has, until very recently, been mostly ignored in medieval studies, or when addressed, written off as an irrelevant or anachronistic modern concept. However, important recent work has demonstrated not only the value, but also the necessity of discussing race in relation to the Middle Ages, a period that contributed considerably to the formation of the concept. Of course, race is a cultural artifact, not a constant. And the medieval versions of it are different from later iterations, but this shouldn't prevent their study. Geraldine Hang's landmark 2018 book, The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages, is divided into chapters on what she defines as religious race, colonial race, cartographic race, and epidermal race. These structures of oppression are justified in one period by God and in another by science. They were used yesterday to enslave, they're used today to exploit, and tomorrow they will surely be used. And they certainly will if we in our teaching and our research and our lives remain silent. As David Theo Goldberg argues, race refuses to remain silent because it isn't just a word, it's a set of conditions shifting over time, never just one thing. It is a way, or really ways of thinking, and a way or ways of living, a disposition. It is a passion released or charged up and put into gear by events, concerns, troubles, both prompt and product of social tensions and catastrophes. The silence which has existed in my fields on race, in contrast, reflects fear of change and desire for a maintenance of a deeply problematic status quo. Since race refuses to be silent, we should refuse to be silent about it. And as Audre Lorde writes, there are so many silences to be broken. So, several scholars have recently produced powerful studies of the development and function of medieval racisms in text, image, and law, but very few have considered the role of maps. Really, only Deborah Strickland has given this much consideration in addition to the work I've been doing, and her work is fabulous. As Francesco Lavino writes about maps more generally, he says, maps are a symptom as well as a symbol of the culture producing them. Location is vital to the enterprise of identity construction, to figuring out who we are as individuals or as part of a group, as a nation, however we might construe it. So cartography has a lot to add to this discussion. Geography is identity. If we're to understand how medieval Christians conceived of themselves, we need to see how they located themselves and those they othered in geographical space. Location is only and by necessity relational, never absolute. As Dennis Wood argues, maps are about relationships. In other words, they're about how one landscape, a landscape of roads, of rivers, of cities, government, sustenance, poison, the good life of whatever, is positioned in relation to another. The map can't simply say that something is present in what? Or that it's distributed in relation to what? I've been working on medieval images of racialized others on maps, though not always explicitly in those terms, for about 20 years. In early modern cartography, the leading scholar dealing with these issues is the fabulous Stuart Davies, whose masterful book has really cleared the field. As she writes, maps were key artifacts in the fluctuating shape of the human in the European imaginary in an era of transformative, often catastrophic cultural contacts. Catastrophic cultural contacts. In scholarship on medieval maps, the fascinating clusters of monstrous peoples that we find in southern Africa on several of the maps, most prominently on the Hereford Map we looked at, the Psalter Map, which is this one, an Ebsdorf map you saw briefly, those figures have received some attention. On the small Psalter Map, the whole manuscript is only about yay big, and the map itself is about 3 inches in diameter. These fantasized races are locked into a series of tight boxes at the right edge of the map. These beings have often been called monstrous races, though I wonder if this terminology encourages modes of thought whereby race, a property that is often only assigned to the disempowered, the so-called non-normative, the so-called marked groups, where race itself is construed as monstrous. In discussions of the monstrous race, the race that is always really being constructed, though only implicitly, is the unnamed, purported non-monstrous, that is to say, normal race, which is, of course, on these maps, European Christian whiteness. That the wondrous beings of Africa on the Psalter Map are painted absolutely white has oddly gone without any comment. By presenting these othered beings as purely white, as the same shade of white used for the figure of Christ above the world, likely painted in white lead, ironically, which is the lowest status metal in the period, as whiter even than the sensing angels that flank him, who are basically left the unpainted color of the vellum, the animal skin on which this is made. These figures' functions as racialized Africans is often, to our eyes, obscured. The tiny figures are not treated by the preponderance of modern scholars who have studied them as if they are really intended as images of Africans, though of course, that is exactly what these animalistic hybrids, inhuman cannibals, and headless horrors, naked and therefore apparently cultureless, though still armed with weapons and therefore presumably dangerous, were intended by their makers to present. Such care was expended to make these minuscule figures so precise. They are just barely visible by the naked eye. The variety and intricacy is diverting. Since we are inculcated to see race as first and foremost about color, as epidermal race, as Geraldine Hang called it, modern viewers tend to gloss over the Africanness of these beings. Working from west to east, that is from bottom to top, we encounter a dog-headed cynocephalus eating a human leg, a cannibal figure also eating a human leg, the crawling himantopus, the animal riding troglodyte, the epiphagus who has his eyes in his shoulders, the blemmy who has his eyes on his chest, my personal favorite of all monsters, the large-lipped Amyctrichdii, a single-footed sciopod, the Mauritania ethiopes, the salmire, the person who speaks using only gestures, straw drinkers whose mouths are very tiny, the Arabatitus who walk stooped over, and the people without noses. These figures present a collective mass of purportedly African monstrosity jammed between the Blue Nile and the Green Ocean, contained within their little boxes, and all of them are white. However, almost no attention has been paid to the curious presentation. Where are my winds? There we are. The curious presentation of the winds around the map's circumference. The place where race has been banished, thrust to the very edge of the world. Whiteness is elevated, literally elevated, in the person of Christ, who appears on the top on both of the maps. These are two sides of the same page. You can see him there dominating the world on each. But even ruddy actual human tones are completely evacuated from the surface of the earth itself. Instead, they only appear in the anthropomorphic, that is human-like winds that surround the world. The four winds blowing from the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, are presented as white, though not white, not lead white, not the white of the other figures in the earth. On the other hand, the 8 lesser winds, so the north by northwest wind and so on, are presented in a curious blue-black color that was commonly used in the Middle Ages to denote so-called Ethiopian figures, also used for so-called Saracen figures, which is a term based on a medieval fiction that claim by Christians that Muslims falsely claim to descend from Abraham's Jewish wife Sarah, hence Saracen, rather than his Egyptian concubine Hagar. Deeply, deeply problematic term, often used in scholarship as if it's perfectly fine. The strange, rather inhuman blue-black color of these lesser winds, as well as this blemmy Saracen figure, are frequently used to depict both African figures and Muslim figures and conflated African Muslim figures. For example, it's used to describe 4 figures in the Cursor Mundi, which is a 14th century world history, which reads, and this is Middle English, black and blah as lead they were, oh their black hue it was selkuth, which means black and blue as lead they were. owe their black hue, it was marvelous. Unless that Selkuth, marvelous nature of this color seems to be some kind of positive quality, the text immediately lets us know these figures are monstrous. They have no heads, and their faces are on their chests, like the inset figure there. These are blemmies, like those on the Psalter Map. The Cursor Mundi continues. It tells us, Sama never forwit that or, swa frauen de schapen creatur, which is, man never saw before that hour such a horribly shaped creature. Then, at this moment in the story, these figures, these horribly shaped black and blue as lead figures, are greeted by King David, who uses a magic rod that he has to strike them and convert them to Christianity, at which point the text tells us, als tiet als milk their hide became saquite, which means as white as milk, their hide became so quickly. So conversion to Christianity is simultaneously transformation to whiteness. In a hefty footnote in an article about early modern maps, Chet Van Duzer gives us a great list of textual sources for black winds that occasionally appear in early modern maps, so later than these. And these include passages from Horace's Epodes, which describes the black southeast wind, and Ovid's very famous Metamorphoses, which describes notus terribilem picia tectus caligine vultum, the south wind, his terrible face shrouded in pitch black darkness. It's not clear what these passages mean at all. Wind is air, right? So it's colorless. So blackness here can't mean the color of the wind, because wind has no color. So it must mean something else. And given the surrounding adjectives, it seems to refer to some sort of malignancy. The face of the wind is not merely picia, black as pitch, but terribilem, terrible. Van Duzer notes that he hasn't found any passages in medieval literature where wind is described as black, but visual art often does work that texts aren't doing. So we don't need a text when we have maps that show us just this happening. So both the reference to black skin in the Cursor Mundi and to black winds in the classical text that may have inspired faces on the Psalter Map are in immediate proximity to language intended to control the reader's response. This blackness is supposed to be viewed as horrible and terrible. On the Psalter Map, it's not only blackness that's banished to the world's edge, but human tonal variety and physicality itself. In the world contained in this manuscript, even supposedly racial difference is constructed, that is, the supposed racial difference of all those figures in Africa, is constructed in terms of whiteness. And any other potential racing, especially the racing of Europeans as people with actual color, is forced out of the world itself. The only other figures presented in this world are Adam and Eve, in the circle that denotes Eden, which was, as I said, thought to be an actual location in the distant east. The first couple, the progenitors of all humanity, like those monsters to their right, like Christ above, are straight white. And in an unusual move, which I haven't found in any other medieval maps, they're presented against black. All the negative space of the garden is filled in with black paint so that the whiteness of these figures positioned as humanity's origins is emphasized and opposed to black. It's not only the rivers of paradise, which you can see flowing out of Eden, but the whiteness of the primordial pair in open and hostile defiance of that ruddy, cheerful face that blows its colored wind down against the wall that shelters them. Now, it was really important to medieval Christians to debate whether all the peoples of the world, themselves and their neighbors, as well as those dog-headed cannibals and so on, whether they all descended from the same parents, whether they all came from Adam and Eve. And St. Augustine of Hippo, who is arguably the most important figure in the history of Christianity after Christ and the apostles, he argued that fundamentally all races had to have come from the same. There could only be one human race to which even these monsters, if they existed, which he had some doubts about, must belong. So maybe this has something to do with why the Psalter Map's tiny beings, the cynocephalists and sciapods and Ethiops and all the rest, are, in Madeline Cavaniss' sly phrasing, as, should we say, pure white. In essence, the Psalter Map frames the dog-headed cannibals and headless blemmies of fantasy as more human, their lineage of descent from Adam and Eve clear in their whiteness, than the North African and Middle Eastern groups with whom European Christians were in frequent contact, othered by their epidermal racialization, by their blue-black skin. The tiny circle containing Eden then is a microcosm of the Psalter Map's construction of the round world as a space of whiteness, but one ringed with the encroaching threat of race on all sides. This makes more complex the apparent dichotomy between whiteness and blackness, which in the Middle Ages often amounted to good and bad, as well as quote unquote pagan and Christian. This might recall the famous dichotomy enforcing line from the Song of Roland, which reads, "Pagans are wrong, Christians are right." Deborah Strickland reparaphrases that as, in visual terms, pagans are black and Christians are white. Well, this is largely true in medieval and early modern art. On the Psalter Map, in any case, it's more complicated. The key, though, is that in both cases, both the white monsters within the earth and the blue-black people outside of it, it is not only other races that are being constructed here, as is ubiquitous in pre-modern art, literature, cartography, and on, but always unspoken. It is whiteness that is being constructed here, and it is a whiteness that is allowed to continue to operate in the shadows, unspoken, unvoiced. Those who argue that medievalists should not talk about race ask us to abandon the field as the Psalter Map grants the entire earth to this whiteness that stands unquestioned at the heart of Christian European thought. Of course, this is not a problem that ended when the Middle Ages ended. It carried right on into the Renaissance, where maps continue to marginalize non-whites in a variety of ways. For example, on this hand-painted edition of Francesco Rosselli's oval planisphere, which was made around 1508, here the painter went in over a printed map and altered the wind's faces from the print he was coloring in, changing them to racialize them by painting their skin in darker shades and replacing their wavy blonde hair with short, dark curls. Cartographical racial marginalization happens again and again and again. We can find it in the very famous 15th century Nuremberg Chronicle. Now here, this is a map that retains all those monstrous people from medieval cartography, the dogheads and headless blemmies and so on, but it puts them off the world itself. So they run in these three vertical columns, each with figures in little boxes. Two of these columns are on the page, just on the back of the page of the map, and then the last column appears right next to it. Within the segmented border of the map, the winds are all white, indeed blonde and hand-colored in some of the hand-colored versions. But holding up the frame of the earth are the sons of Noah, going back to the TO maps, Japheth, Shem, and Ham. They inherit the earth after the flood, but not equally, because Ham's laughter at his father's drunkenness. Noah is the first vintner, the first one to brew wine according to the Bible, and also the first drunk, and his youngest son sees him naked and drunk and laughs at him, while his older sons totally cover his nakedness. The book of Genesis lays out punishment for the descendants of Ham. You see that here, this turbaned figure. So Genesis says, when Noah awoke from his wine and found out what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." This enslaved race granted Africa by God as a punishment. is here depicted as a racialized other, with a hooked nose and a long beard and heavy lips used in standard caricatures of Jews, but also wears a headdress that evokes Islam. Such hybridized Jewish Muslim figures are really common in medieval and Renaissance art, such as in a similar marginal figure in the lower left of Hieronymus Bosch's Christ Mock from 1510, who bears a strong, if utterly generic, resemblance to the Nuremberg Chronicles image of Ham. Though here, that headband is replaced with a long hood that bears the emblematic crescent, moon, and star that marks this figure as a Muslim. The marginalization of race carries straight on through the Renaissance and indeed was foundational to the so-called scientific revolution, as embodied, for example, in Sir Isaac Newton himself. Newton, in his Optics, which was published in 1704 when he was president of the Royal Society, constructed a color wheel that presents a center containing what he referred to as white of the first order, and then categorizes all other colors based on, and I'm quoting him, the distance from whiteness. As Dipesh Chakrabarty argues, the so-called universal ideas that European thinkers produced in the period from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, and that have since influenced projects of modernity and modernization all over the world, could never be completely universal and pure concepts. Why? Because critical thought always remains related to place, and it always bears the prejudices of those places. So Newton's work brings us full circle back to the Psalter Map, where the black faces of the winds are pressed to the outside, where they've been marooned for more than 700 years, looking in at a world from which they have been purposefully excluded. How might modern people respond to this material? How might contemporary writers and artists speak back to it? As one provocative example, in the corridors that connect Hereford Cathedral to its famous chain library and to the room that houses that extraordinary world map I began with, there now hang a series of large, boldly colored textiles by Yinka Shonibare. These are a series of works called Creatures of the Mapamundi, inspired by, of course, the Hereford Map, and commissioned by the Cathedral and the Meadow Arts Association, which is an English arts organization. Shonibare is a highly celebrated British Nigerian artist who calls himself a post-colonial hybrid. And so it's unsurprising that he was interested in the colonial hybrids of medieval cartography. The large Hereford map is home to a series of marginalized, monsterized people more extensive than the one on the Psalter map. In Shonibare's Creatures of the Mapamundi, we find the map's sciopod, the one-footed people, the bird-footed people, that's what's behind him in that photograph of him, and the dog-headed cynocephali on the right, among others. The cynocephali on the Hereford map are labeled gigantes, giants, and they're presented as a pair reaching out to one another. They're just outside the Garden of Eden as part of what I think of as a three-part series. Adam and Eve are in the garden. I know it's a little hard to make them out, but they're on the left of that image. Eve is reaching up to pluck the fruit from the serpent who is curled around the tree. Then Adam and Eve are expelled by an angel who waves a fiery sword at them, and they turn back tearfully, wringing their hands with sorrow. And finally, just past them, the cynocephali reach out to one another, raising their heads in an apparent gesture of despair as they seem to howl at the sky. The dog-headed person on the right is clearly male, and the one on the left is not clear, but I've long thought of these as a sort of transformed couple, barking their misery at the state of separation from God, the loss of Eden. Unlike the monstrous people of the Psalter map, none of the ones on the Hereford map are painted in, so none are white, but then neither are Adam and Eve, nor, oh, there's the ones on the Psalter map, and Christ himself and the heavenly host, which are above the whole map in the Last Judgment scene, are all just the unpainted calfskin on which they're drawn. Shonibare's cynocephali exist in a far more colorful world. They are presented against a backdrop of blazing fabrics with a green sky and multicolored and patterned hills. The cynocephali themselves, though, are jet black, as are the so-called, as are all the rest of the creatures of Shonibare's series. He has left many of the threads of his textile dangling untrimmed, giving something of an impression that we're looking at the back of wall hangings, at some sort of usually hidden backstory. Long threads hang down from the cynocephali's eyes, as if they, like the map's figures of Adam and Eve, are weeping as they cry out. Shonobari depicts these racialized beings, often in the Middle Ages, associated with racialized Muslims, and all the rest of his figures as Black. He states that this work was inspired by the ability of the Mapamundi to still be reflecting our contemporary concerns of fear of the stranger or other, which often leads, as he says, to xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. In rendering as Black figures that he calls extinct creatures of legend, Shonobari restores or reveals the racialization foisted on them from the start, obscured by their whiteness on the Psalter Map and by the calfskin bodies in the Hereford Map, but more fundamentally by our own strategies of avoidance. So, in conclusion, in the famous Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Tom Stoppard's existentialist retelling of Hamlet, the title characters are on a boat that they have been told is sailing to England so that they may deliver the mad Prince Hamlet to the English king. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are unsure about more or less everything. At this point, they don't even believe their own names. They hold no knowledge as certain that that of their own past and present is no more clear to them than their future. They're stuck in a strange, eternal, indefinite now. And we pick up with them lamenting.
I don't believe it.
Oh.
What a shambles. We're just not getting anywhere. Not even England. And I don't believe in it anyway. In what? England.
Just a conspiracy of cartographers, you mean?
I mean, I don't believe it.
Just a conspiracy of cartographers. That's what he makes of England. In the original play, he carries on. He says, I have no image. I'm trying to picture us arriving, a little harbor perhaps, roads, inhabitants to point the way, horses on the roads riding for a day or a fortnight, and then a palace and the English king. That would be the logical kind of thing, but my mind remains a blank. No, we're slipping off the map. Though Guildenstern's quip is presented as a punchline, I would argue that England was indeed a conspiracy of cartographers. That's the subject of a new book I completed writing Monday. Of course, the invention of a nation, whether we take that to mean people or a place, is never the product of a single sector of society, and the so-called conspiracy, which I say with my tongue firmly planted in my cheek, included royalty, clergy, authors, artists, and on. But amidst such heady company, map makers played a key role. There's a curious inversion of modern expectations here. We're used to cartography being a science, and of science being used as the underpinning for racial categorizations. Both maps and racial depictions are clearly present in medieval sources, but neither is connected to the post-Enlightenment scientific paradigm we might reflexively think of. Both are instead embedded in religious modes of thought that freighted these ideas with even greater significance. As I explored at the outset of this talk, these maps were designed according to a series of explicitly Christian beliefs about the origins of humanity and the flow of history from that moment of creation through the fall, through the biblical period, and on down the map. But we get all the way to the bottom and we find there Terminus Europa. That is the end of Europe. And that means we have to return back up to the top, where we find the depiction of the Last Judgment, the end of time, with the saved entering heaven on Christ's right and the damned entering the mouth of hell on his left. Directly below the start of the group of the saved souls is not merely England, but the town of Hereford itself, where this map was made and has been displayed for 700 years. Below the mouth of hell, of course, are those monstrous figures, as well as other groups. The logic of these maps is clear. Salvation and damnation, they implicitly argue, can both be read upon the surface of the body and be determined based on location on the surface of the earth. That is why the black and blue blemmies of the cursor mundi become as white as milk upon their conversion, and also why maps are such an important part of the larger project of racializing and hierarchizing all the peoples of the world. This history is long, and it is knotty, and it is high time that medievalists started untangling it. Thank you.
If we could, of course, we would all be applauding now, Dr. Mittman, but we can't quite do that. We can't quite do that. So let's see if we have some questions that people would like to submit, and we will get them for you very soon. So what I would ask participants to do is to write your questions in the chat. I think that's the best way to do it, and then we'll proceed from there. Although I see one, we'll start with, since I can't get, okay, Albert Klassen, why don't you go ahead if you will unmute, and then all others after this, please write your question into the chat, which we will then log and deal with. Dr. Klassen, please, if you will unmute.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to start my video, but that doesn't work. You only hear my voice. But at any rate, I was very happy about this talk. Asa, it was great. The visuals, as usual, is really fantastic. So I would really laud you in this effort to combine maps with racism, or the projection of racism in the Middle Ages, you know, race before race. All that is extremely valuable. And I would like to raise two questions, maybe three brief ones, is first of all, your understanding of these Mapamundi. And I would say that latest research, and I myself have written about it, has increasingly argued that we really should comprehend these medieval maps not even as maps. Maybe the whole categorical approach as maps is inappropriate, but rather they are an interpretation of the world in religious terms, or maybe as representatives of the human path through this world. I myself just wrote a book, published a book on tracing the trails, where I have a lengthy article where I try to argue that the map really becomes a metaphor of, let's say, the pilgrimage through life. So that's the first question, and maybe you might agree with that. I would love to hear from you. The other question pertains to, that's a much larger question. I'm not quite sure whether we even have time to answer that. This, the presentation of Black people in medieval or early modern literature is a very complex issue. And I've posted in the chat a reference to a very nice and wonderful anthology, mostly ignored by American and other non-German speakers. This is an excellent anthology which forces us to acknowledge that there were many presentations of Black people in most positive terms, long before racism even started. So white knights falling in love with Black queens, for example, Black people appearing at court, and even within religion, one of the first Christian saints was Saint Maurice. And many people confuse him with the Moor, which then becomes a racist notion in the modern times. But for the medieval people, the Moor was Maurice, was one of the best Christians ever, who was martyred. So I'm not quite sure whether you can even enter this. This is a highly complex thing, but you invited us to think about it because you have these monsters at the margin of the world, of the Mapamundi, Hereford or Ebsdorf. And so it is a question whether these are just projections of the monstrous type which we just need. There always have to be monsters. at the edge of our world. Epistemologically speaking, without monsters, we don't know who we are. I mean, in modern science fiction, for example, the monsters are always out there in the outer space. We need them. They are necessary for us, for our own identity. Whether that really helps us to understand notions of racism, I don't know. That's a maybe different category. But I open a can of worms, so I'm sorry if I open this too much. Thank you.
Oh,
no,
that-
it's excellent. We'll ask for fairly concise response, which may be hard, Asa, but let's see.
I'll
how
do
we
my
do.
best.
Yeah.
So first off, great to see you as always, Albert. Regarding whether maps are maps, whether these are maps, so I take the point, but I would push back in one sense, which is that I would argue that all that you said about medieval maps is actually true of all maps from all times. They are always ideological diagrams that chart their makers' perspectives. They are never the scientific, straightforward enterprise that they claim to be. That's one of the reasons they're so powerful, because they seem to be some kind of neutral presentation, but in fact are always in the service of ideological goals. So medieval maps do that, modern maps do that, all the maps in between do that. That's just how maps work. So I would say they're maps in the sense that all maps do that, but that maps are not what we think they are. The other one, yeah, that is a big, complicated question. It is deeply complex, no question. The Hereford Map itself speaks of, if we zoom in over here, this is the Porta Nibae, that's the gate to Nubia, the Nubian mountains. It tells us that the gens Nibae, the Nubian people, are, it tells us, Christianissime, the most Christian people. But then if we read other texts that tell us what they thought about them, we find out that they are Nestorians, which was a heretical group, and that they're doing all various kinds of things wrong, but they're still better than other peoples, for example. So it's complex. It is not by any means two-dimensional, but then race never is, right? It's always complex, which is why it takes a lot of work to unpack.
There's a question here about, so these are medieval maps of the West, and we can argue about whether they're really maps or not. In comparison with maps from other cultures, which I assume also are existent, do they not put their cultures or themselves at the center of their maps and the other people outside and probably in a lesser light than they?
Okay, excellent question. So here, you've got my screen, yeah? So there's that Psalter Map again. Curiously, these maps are rather unusual in not putting themselves at the center. So these maps are made in England. England is here. It is the little nook down in the lower left corner. The thing that's in the center, that's Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, in the period that most of these were made, was inaccessible to Europeans, to Christians, because well, it had been until the Christians launched the Crusades, at which point the Muslim powers in charge closed off most access. And so many maps from many parts of the world do, in fact, present their makers as being at the center of the world. But these European Christian maps generally do not do that. Here's the one I was looking for. This is an ancient Chinese map, for example, and the section right in the center is of the princely domains. And as we work our way outward, we work further and further from sort of the known and familiar and into greater and greater danger. The last zone around the edge of the world is a wonderful phrase. The zone at the edge is called the zone of cultureless savagery. So yes, many groups put themselves in the middle. Curiously enough, medieval European Christians did not.
But what you're saying with this map is that the Chinese regarded anybody else other than they as at the margins and certainly not equal to them.
Well, they work their way outward. So I wouldn't say everybody, because it happens in stages. You go from the center, which is the princely domains, outward. Let's see if I can pull this up. I've got it all translated here. Do I? There we go. So the royal domains give on to the zone of tributary feudal princes, which gives on to the zone of tributary lords, and then the zone of pacification, and the zone of allied barbarians, and then only the zone of, only at the very edge, the zone of cultureless savagery. So, Christian maps do something quite similar, which is the further you get from the holy sacred center, Jerusalem, the stranger things become. But this does set up a problematic dynamic for the English people making these maps, because they are themselves in essence, the zone of cultureless savagery. And this breeds a lot of thought and writing and brooding about what it means to be this marginal people, people living out in the fringe of the world, crammed off in a kind of faraway, distant corner.
Great. Here's a question. We'll try and parse it. Though we talked about the use of these maps as theological and sociocultural reflections of medieval ideologies, were these maps ever used in context of travel, which is to say what we normally consider maps for? Were people trying to find their way back to the Garden of Eden? Or were they more like a classroom fetish or somewhat of a pedagogical tool?
Well, there's a fabulous question, not a bad question at all. No, they don't seem to have navigated with maps at all, which, if you look at their maps, I mean, you can't really. That's not what they're for. But I would note, we actually don't use maps to navigate as like, that's not the only thing. We use them for a lot of things. So you mentioned, classroom walls, we use them for teaching. And we do have a text, Hugh of St. Victor, tells us how he used maps in his own classroom teaching in a French monastery. So we know that they did that. And they appear in royal halls as well as monasteries and cathedrals. But we also put maps in the start of books, right? We put them in history books so that you can see where history goes. We love putting them actually in fantasy novels and science fiction, where we're creating whole artificial worlds. It's a great place to have maps. Even Tolkien made the original maps that went with, the Lord of the Rings and so on. And this one that you're seeing, the Psalter Map, is called that because it's the beginning of the Book of the Psalms, which was a main piece of devotional practice in the period. And so it's helping set the Psalms in the context of the world and ideas about salvation as presented throughout it. So no, they didn't use them to navigate. Yes, we sometimes do, but we also use them for a whole lot of other things like they did.
Seems to me it's about navigation of the soul rather than navigation of place.
Absolutely. There is a destination, but the destination is heaven.
Yeah, and salvation. Wonderful. Look, it's a little after 6:15. We're a little later than usual. My suggestion, don't worry, Asa. My conclusion is let's do this. Dan is going to play a little music as people leave us if they wish to do so. If you are so willing and not extraordinarily hungry, if you would like to stay on for a few more minutes, we can converse somewhat openly and people can hear a conversation if they like for another 5 or 10 minutes, just about other things about what you've talked about and interests of yours. And we found that often very engaging if you're willing to do that.
I'd be happy to.
Wonderful. If Dan Linder, if you were still there, as I hope you are, and why don't you play us some music to leave by as we contemplate all that we have heard from you and all that we've heard from Asa Mittman. What are you going to play us?
Sure. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for that fascinating talk. It was really, really great to listen to that. So I'll be ending today, the talk today, with a work by Gabriella Lena Frank. Gabriella Lena Frank is an American composer. She currently serves as a composer in residence for the Philadelphia Orchestra. She lives in Boonville, a small town in Northern California, where she mentors young composers at Gabriella Lena Frank Creative Academy of Music. She often explores her rich multicultural heritage and incorporates many diverse influences into her work. She explores especially her unique heritage. Her mother is Chinese Peruvian. Her father is Lithuanian Jewish. The Nocturno Nazqueño in particular is the work that I'll be playing today. It was composed in 2014. This piece is inspired by the configurations of the Nazca Lines. The Nazca Lines are ancient geoglyphs in the Peruvian desert. At ground level, these are often a confusing maze of lines. However, from higher in the sky, be seen as patterns that depict animals, plants, and other geometric shapes. So that's something you might be able to hear in the music today. So this is the Nocturno Nazqueño by Gabriela Lina Frank.
How long is it, Dan, do you figure about?
It's about a 7 or 8 minute piece.
Cool.
Yeah.
Here we go. you.